Welcome, dear traveller, to this quiet corner where stories unfold like whispered secrets in the depths of winter's embrace. Tonight, we journey together into a mystery wrapped in snowfall and shadow, a tale designed to ease your thoughts and guide you gently toward peaceful slumber. Allow the tension of the day to melt away as we step into a world of flickering gaslight and ancient mysteries, where every question finds its answer and every pathway leads toward rest. I wonder, as you listen now, from wherever you find yourself, perhaps beneath warm blankets, perhaps watching moonlight filter through your window, what distant corners of the world cradle you tonight? But wherever you are, know that this story wraps around you like a comforting presence, asking nothing but that you surrender to its rhythm. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling upon London for 3 consecutive days, transforming the cobblestones into mirrors that reflected the amber glow of street lamps, each droplet adding its voice to the symphony that whispered against the windows of our rooms at Baker Street. I sat in my familiar chair, listening to the fire crackle and shift within the hearth, watching shadows dance their eternal waltz across the walls, while the warmth pressed gently against my face. Sherlock Holmes occupied his customary position near the window, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen eyes watching the rivulets trace their wandering paths down the glass. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, of the faint mineral scent that rain always brought, and of the tea that Mrs. Hudson had delivered moments before, steaming gently in its porcelain pot upon the side table. "Watson," Holmes murmured without turning from the window, his voice barely louder than the rainfall itself. "Observe how the rain falls differently upon the rooftops across the street. Heavier upon the eastern slopes, lighter upon the western. The wind, you see, comes from the northeast, driving the droplets at an angle that speaks of distant storms travelling across the countryside." I nodded, sipping my tea slowly, feeling the liquid warmth spread through me like contentment itself. "You read the weather as others read newspapers, Holmes. All things tell stories to those who learn their language," he replied, finally turning toward me with the faintest suggestion of a smile touching his aquiline features. "The rain speaks of atmospheric pressures and thermal currents. The fire whispers of oak wood, well seasoned, cut perhaps 2 winters past. Your teacup reveals that you have stirred it precisely 3 times, your habitual number, and that you prefer it slightly cooler than most, waiting always those extra moments before the first sip." Before I could respond to these observations, the sound of footsteps ascending the stairs reached us. Hurried steps, but not frantic, purposeful rather than panicked. Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock followed, and then her kind face appeared in the doorway, concern etching subtle lines around her eyes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, forgive the late hour, but there is a gentleman here who insists the matter cannot wait until morning. A Mr. Cornelius Ashford, from Yorkshire. He appears quite distressed, though he maintains his composure admirably." Holmes straightened immediately, his entire demeanour shifting from contemplative repose to focused attention. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps bring another cup. The gentleman will have travelled far in this weather and will appreciate something warm." Moments later, our visitor entered, a man of perhaps 50 years, his travelling coat still glistening with raindrops that caught the firelight like scattered diamonds. His face bore the weathered quality of of one who spent considerable time outdoors. Yet his clothing spoke of substantial means and refined taste. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, moved between Holmes and myself with an expression that mingled hope with something deeper, perhaps sorrow, perhaps wonder. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I apologize for this intrusion," he began, his voice carrying the rounded vowels of Yorkshire, softened by obvious education. "I have travelled since dawn, changing trains twice, and arriving in London only an hour past. My situation is most peculiar, and I confess I scarce know how to explain it without seeming to speak of fairy tales rather than facts." Holmes gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. "Please, sit, warm yourself. Facts often wear the costume of fancy, and I have long since learned that the most extraordinary truths frequently masquerade as impossibilities. Watson, would you pour for our guest?" I did so, handing Mr. Ashford a cup that he accepted with visible gratitude, wrapping both hands around it, as though drawing strength from its heat. The rain continued its patient percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the distance a clock chimed the hour, 11 deep, sonorous notes that seemed to mark this moment as significant, a threshold between the ordinary day and whatever mystery the night would unfold. "I am the proprietor of a small estate in the Yorkshire moors," Ashford began, speaking slowly, choosing each word with care. "The village nearby, Thornwick, consists of perhaps 200 souls, farmers, craftsmen, a few scholars who prefer the isolation for their studies. 3 weeks ago, we experienced an unusual early snowfall, heavy and sustained, which effectively isolated the village from the surrounding countryside. The roads became impassable, the train station buried, and we found ourselves quite cut off from the outside world." He paused, sipping his tea, and in that moment the fire shifted, sending a cascade of sparks upward into the chimney with a soft, rushing whisper. "During this isolation," he continued, "something extraordinary occurred. Objects began appearing in the village, objects that had no business being there, that belonged to no one, yet clearly had been crafted with remarkable skill and evident purpose. A wooden box, carved with symbols none of our scholars could identify, appeared upon the steps of the church. A journal, written in a mixture of languages, materialized in the village library. Strange marks appeared in the snow, not footprints precisely, but patterns, geometric and deliberate, surrounding these objects like ceremonial boundaries." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with interest. "And the villagers, their response to these phenomena?" "Initially, curiosity and speculation," Ashford replied. "But as the objects accumulated, there are now 7 in total, unease has grown. Some speak of ancient legends, of the moors holding secrets older than memory. Others seek rational explanations, but find none that satisfy. The snow has only just begun to melt, making travel possible again, and I came immediately to London to seek your assistance. Whatever is happening in Thornwick, Mr. Holmes, it touches upon something profound, something that exists in the space between known and unknown." I watched Holmes absorb this information, his face a study in concentration, his fingers returning to their steepled position. Outside, the rain seemed to intensify momentarily, as though nature itself leaned closer to listen. "These objects," Holmes said quietly, "you brought evidence of them, I presume?" Ashford reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, which he opened carefully upon his lap. From within, he produced a series of sketches, detailed renderings of the mysterious items he had described. The first showed the wooden box, its surface covered in interlocking spiral patterns that seemed to suggest movement, as though the symbols might rotate if one watched long enough. The second depicted pages from the journal, filled with text that appeared to blend Latin, Old English, and characters I did not recognize at all. Beautiful, Holmes murmured, studying the sketches with the intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts. The craftsmanship alone suggests someone of considerable skill and patience. The symbols follow a pattern, Watson. Do you see? They repeat at intervals that suggest mathematical precision, yet they incorporate organic elements, curves that mimic natural forms. This is not random decoration, but encoded meaning. Mrs. Hudson returned quietly, refilling our teacups without a word, her presence a comforting constant in the room's focused atmosphere. The fire crackled softly, and I found myself drawn into the mystery. Despite the late hour, my earlier drowsiness transformed into engaged curiosity. "Mr. Ashford," I asked, "these scholars in your village, what manner of studies occupy them?" "One is a linguist, Professor Edmund Blackwell, retired from Cambridge, specializing in ancient languages and dead civilizations. Another, Miss Catherine Marsh, studies folklore and mythology, collecting rural traditions before they vanish into modernity's advance. The third, Dr. Nathaniel Frost, concerns himself with natural philosophy and the historical intersection of science and superstition. All three have examined these objects extensively and concluded only that they are genuine artifacts of considerable age, yet appearing pristine, unmarked by time or weather." Holmes rose from his chair, moving to the window once more, his silhouette framed against the rain-streaked glass. "The isolation is key," he said, speaking more to himself than to us. "During the snowfall, no one could enter or leave. Therefore, either these objects were already present in the village, hidden and now revealed, or they were placed by someone who remained within Thornwick throughout the storm. The patterns in the snow suggest theatrical presentation, a desire to create atmosphere and significance around these discoveries." He turned back toward us, decision crystallizing in his expression. "We shall depart tomorrow, Mr. Ashford, assuming the morning train can carry us northward. Watson, I trust you are free to accompany me. This matter touches upon areas that require not only investigation, but also careful documentation, and your presence would be invaluable." "Of course," I replied immediately, though I confess a part of me wondered what we would find in that isolated village, cut off from the world by snow, and now marked by mysteries that defied simple explanation. Ashford's relief was palpable, his shoulders relaxing as though a weight had lifted. "You cannot know what comfort this brings, Mr. Holmes. The village exists in a state of suspended uncertainty, and your presence will restore, if not answers, then at least the confidence that answers can be found." We spent another hour discussing particulars: the village layout, the individuals involved, the precise timeline of discoveries. Holmes asked questions that seemed tangential, but which I knew from long experience would prove relevant. The quality of the village water supply, the local geology, the direction of prevailing winds, the composition of the soil. Each detail he filed away in that extraordinary mind, building a picture of Thornwick that would guide our investigation once we arrived. Finally, as midnight approached and the rain softened to a gentle whisper, Ashford took his leave, accepting Holmes's offer to secure him lodging nearby. so that we might all depart together in the morning. After he had gone, Holmes and I sat in companionable silence, listening to the fire's quiet conversation with itself. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, my voice drowsy now, the warmth and the hour conspiring to make sleep seem imminent and welcome. "I make of it a puzzle, Watson, which is the finest gift any evening could offer. Someone in Thornwick possesses knowledge of languages, of craft, of theatre in its broadest sense. They have created a mystery deliberately, whether for noble or nefarious purpose remains to be determined. But they have also made an error, for in creating mystery they have invited scrutiny, and scrutiny shall reveal truth." I nodded, rising to retire to my room, but Holmes remained by the window, watching the rain, his mind already walking the snow-covered streets of a village we had not yet seen. That night I slept deeply, my dreams filled with spiraling symbols and falling snow, with distant moors and ancient secrets waiting patiently for discovery. The rain sang its lullaby against the windows, and somewhere in that sound I heard the whisper of the journey that awaited us, a journey into winter's heart, where mysteries bloomed like frost flowers upon glass. Morning arrived, with pale light filtering through clouds that hung low and heavy, pregnant with unspent rain. I woke to the sound of Holmes moving about downstairs, his footsteps purposeful, accompanied by the rustle of papers and the occasional word exchanged with Mrs. Hudson. Rising and dressing quickly, I descended to find breakfast laid, and our host already immersed in a collection of books he had pulled from his shelves, volumes on folklore, architectural history, and medieval symbolism. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me without looking up. "I have been considering the implications of isolated communities and the manner in which they preserve knowledge. Thornwick, being small and remote, likely maintains traditions that urban centres have long forgotten. These objects may not represent something foreign introduced into the village, but rather something deeply embedded in its history, now surfacing for reasons we have yet to discern." I poured coffee, savouring its bitter warmth, and helped myself to toast and preserves. Through the window I could see the street glistening from the night's rain, puddles reflecting the morning sky like scattered mirrors. The city was waking slowly, sounds of horses and cartwheels beginning their daily symphony. Mr. Ashford arrived promptly at 8, looking more rested than the previous evening, his eyes bright with anticipation, despite the underlying concern that still marked his features. We gathered our belongings, Holmes travelling remarkably light, myself bringing a medical bag alongside my suitcase, both of us donning heavy coats against the northern chill we would certainly encounter. The hansom cab carried us through London's stirring streets toward King's Cross Station, the horses' hooves creating rhythmic percussion on the damp cobblestones. I watched the familiar sights pass, shopkeepers opening their establishments, flower sellers arranging their colourful wares, newspaper boys calling headlines to the morning crowd. The ordinary life of the city continued, unaware of the mystery that drew us northward, and I felt the strange displacement that always accompanied our investigations, the sense of straddling two worlds, the known and the unknown. The station greeted us with its characteristic chaos, steam hissing from engines, whistles piercing the air, voices calling farewells and instructions in a dozen different tones. Yet once we boarded the northbound train and found our compartment, a curious calm descended. The whistle blew its departure the platform began to slide away, and we were released into the rhythm of rail travel, that particular quality of movement that exists between motion and stillness. Holmes positioned himself by the window, watching London's outskirts gradually give way to countryside. Ashford sat across from him, occasionally commenting on landmarks or points of geographical interest. I settled into the corner, allowing the train's gentle rocking to lull me into a contemplative state, half awake and half dreaming, watching the landscape transform outside our moving frame. The rain had followed us northward, though lighter now, more mist than downpour, softening the edges of everything we passed. Fields stretched in every direction, sometimes interrupted by clusters of trees that stood like patient gatherings of ancient witnesses. Small stations appeared and disappeared, brief glimpses of rural life, a station master in his uniform, a farm cart waiting at a crossing, children waving at the passing train, with that universal enthusiasm that transcends time and place. "Tell me more about the scholars," Holmes requested as we travelled, his voice barely louder than the train's steady rhythm. Their personalities, their relationships to one another, and to the village as a whole. Ashford shifted in his seat, gathering his thoughts before responding. Professor Blackwell is the eldest, approaching 70, though his mind remains sharp as ever. He retired to Thornwick 15 years ago, seeking quiet for his research into linguistic evolution. He is a gentle soul, soft-spoken, preferring the company of books to people, though he teaches occasionally. Informal lectures on etymology and ancient texts that a few of us attend with pleasure. His cottage sits near the village edge, surrounded by gardens he tends with surprising skill. The train swayed slightly as we rounded a curve, and through the window I glimpsed a river running parallel to the tracks, its surface stippled by the persistent rain. Miss Marsh arrived 5 years past, Ashford continued. Younger, perhaps 35, energetic and passionate about preserving rural traditions. She conducts interviews with our eldest residents, recording their stories, their songs, the beliefs and practices handed down through generations. Some in the village view her with suspicion, considering her interest in old ways as dangerous, an invitation to forces best left undisturbed. Yet she approaches her work with scholarly rigour, seeking understanding rather than sensation. "And Dr. Frost?" Holmes prompted, his eyes still on the passing landscape. The most recent arrival, having come to Thornwick only 2 years ago. He is complicated, brilliant, certainly, but carrying shadows. He speaks sometimes of having abandoned a promising academic career in London due to circumstances he never specifies. His work explores the boundary between superstition and scientific inquiry, particularly how ancient peoples understood natural phenomena they could not yet explain scientifically. He keeps more to himself than the others, though I have found him pleasant enough in our limited interactions. Holmes nodded slowly, absorbing these character sketches, undoubtedly constructing mental profiles that would inform his observations once we arrived. And their reactions to the mysterious objects, did they differ significantly? Professor Blackwell approached them with pure scholarly excitement, immediately beginning translation attempts and historical contextualization. Miss Marsh saw them as validation of local legends she'd been collecting, stories of the Moors holding ancient knowledge. Dr. Frost? He seemed almost unsettled, as though the objects confirmed something he had feared or suspected. He examined them meticulously, but spoke little of his conclusions. The conversation drifted then, meandering like the river outside, touching on the history of Yorkshire, the particular qualities of moorland isolation, the way communities develop unique characters when removed from broader currents of culture and change. Holmes occasionally interjected questions that seemed unrelated, but which I recognized as pieces he was fitting into his ever-expanding mental puzzle. We stopped at York for lunch, disembarking briefly to stretch our legs and take a meal in the station restaurant. The food was simple but well prepared. Beef pie, roasted vegetables, fresh bread with butter. We ate without hurry, appreciating the brief respite from travel, watching other passengers come and go, each carrying their own stories and destinations. The second leg of our journey took us deeper into Yorkshire, the landscape growing increasingly dramatic as gentle farmland gave way to rising hills and eventually to the distinctive character of the moors. The rain had stopped, though heavy clouds remained, creating a ceiling that pressed close to the earth, transforming the world into shades of grey and purple and deep, heather-tinged brown. There is something about this landscape, I murmured, almost to myself, that feels eternal, untouched by the concerns of modern life. Precisely, Ashford agreed. That timelessness is what draws people like our scholars to such places. Here, one can imagine standing in the footsteps of people from centuries past, seeing what they saw, feeling what they felt. The moors change slowly, on geological timescales rather than human ones. Holmes remained quiet, but I could see his attention had sharpened as we entered this distinctive terrain. He was cataloguing details, the patterns of stone walls dividing distant fields, the occasional farmhouse standing alone against the hills. The quality of light that even filtered through clouds possessed a particular clarity. Our train reached the small station of Kirkby Moorside in late afternoon, and from there Ashford had arranged a carriage to carry us the final miles to Thornwick. The conveyance was sturdy rather than elegant, built for rough country roads, pulled by two strong horses whose breath steamed in the cool air. Our luggage was secured, and we set off into the gathering dusk, the wheels crunching on gravel roads that wound between hills like rivers of stone. The driver, a taciturn man of middle years, whom Ashford introduced simply as Thomas, offered little conversation, focusing instead on guiding the horses through terrain that clearly demanded attention. We climbed steadily, the perspective shifting with altitude, offering views across valleys where shadows pooled like dark water, and distant hills receded into layers of progressively lighter grey. "The snow has melted faster than expected," Ashford observed, pointing to patches of white that remained only in the deepest shadows and the highest elevations. "Another few days of above freezing temperatures, and it will vanish entirely, taking with it the patterns that surrounded the objects. One reason I felt urgency in securing your involvement, Mr. Holmes." "Photographs were taken?" Holmes inquired. "Yes. Miss Marsh has some facility with a camera, and documented each discovery as it occurred. The images are available for your examination once we arrive." Darkness was descending in earnest as we finally crested a final rise and saw Thornwick spread below us, a compact cluster of stone buildings gathered around a central square, lights beginning to glow in windows like earthbound stars. The village possessed a timeless quality, its architecture speaking of centuries rather than decades. Each structure built from the same grey stone that formed the walls and outcroppings of the surrounding moors. We descended the final slope as night completed its arrival, the carriage lamps casting golden pools of light that moved with us like protective spirits. The village street was quiet, though I glimpsed faces in windows, watching our arrival with the frank curiosity of small communities where strangers are noted and discussed. The air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter, of damp earth and the complex mineral scent of stone. Ashford directed Thomas to his own residence, a handsome house on the square's western side. 3 stories of well-maintained stone with mullioned windows that glowed warmly from within. As we disembarked, the front door opened, revealing a housekeeper, a woman of mature years, with kind eyes and capable hands, who greeted us with quiet welcome. "Mrs. Pemberton manages my household," Ashford explained as we entered. "She has prepared rooms for you both, and dinner awaits whenever you are ready." The interior matched the exterior's promise, comfortable without ostentation, furnished with pieces that spoke of quality and age, warmed by fires burning in multiple hearths. The entrance hall featured dark wood panelling, a staircase ascending into shadows, and several doors leading to what I presumed were drawing room, dining room, and study. The atmosphere was one of learned comfort, the home of someone who valued thought and quietude. We were shown to our respective chambers, mine a pleasant room overlooking the square, furnished with a sturdy bed, a writing desk, a comfortable chair near the fireplace, where a fire had already been laid and lit. I took a moment to wash and change from my travel clothes, appreciating the warmth and the simple luxury of stillness after so many hours of movement. When I descended to the drawing room, I found Holmes already there, standing before the fire with a glass of sherry in hand, speaking quietly with Ashford. The room embodied Victorian comfort: leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with volumes that showed signs of regular reading, small tables positioned for convenience, heavy curtains drawn against the night. A lamp with a green glass shade illuminated the space with gentle light that seemed to gather around it like mist. "Ah, Watson," Holmes greeted me. "Mr. Ashford was just explaining that he has invited Professor Blackwell, Miss Marsh, and Dr. Frost to join us for dinner. I thought it best to meet them together initially, to observe their interactions and hear their perspectives on recent events without the formality of scheduled interviews." "Excellent idea," I replied, accepting my own glass of sherry from our host. The liquid was amber in the lamplight, and it warmed me from the inside, completing the transformation from traveller to guest. A knock at the door announced the arrival of our dinner companions, and Mrs. Pemberton ushered them in. 3 individuals whose appearances matched Ashford's descriptions, yet possessed that indefinable quality of presence that descriptions can never quite capture. Professor Blackwell entered first, a tall man whose age showed primarily in his silver hair and the gentle stoop of shoulders that had spent decades bent over books. His eyes, however, sparkled with youthful curiosity, and his smile was genuine and welcoming. He wore tweeds that had seen considerable wear but remained dignified, and his hands, as he shook first Holmes's and then mine, felt dry and light, like parchment. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, what an unexpected pleasure to have minds of your caliber visiting our little village. I confess I have followed accounts of your cases with great interest, particularly those involving historical puzzles and linguistic challenges." Miss Catherine Marsh followed, a woman of medium height with dark hair pulled back in a practical style, dressed in clothing that managed to be both feminine and functional. Her eyes assessed us with intelligence and a hint of caution, as though she were deciding whether we represented help or hindrance to her own investigations. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of education overlaid on working-class origins. "I hope you approach what you will find here with open minds. Phenomena exist that do not fit comfortably into the frameworks that urban rationality prefers." Dr. Nathaniel Frost entered last, and I immediately understood what Ashford had meant by complicated. He was perhaps 40, with features that would have been handsome had they not been marked by an expression of perpetual weariness. His eyes held intelligence, but also something else, a haunted quality, as though he carried knowledge he wished he could forget. His clothing was formal, almost overly so for a country dinner, suggesting someone clinging to urban standards in rural surroundings. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he acknowledged with a slight bow. "I confess ambivalence about your arrival. Solutions to mysteries often prove more disturbing than the mysteries themselves." "An intriguing position for a scholar of natural philosophy," Holmes observed mildly, gesturing for everyone to sit. "Yet, I would argue that knowledge, however disturbing, surpasses ignorance." "Perhaps," Frost replied, taking a chair somewhat apart from the others, "though ignorance sometimes serves as a kindness." Mrs. Pemberton announced dinner, and we moved to the dining room, where a substantial meal awaited: roasted lamb, root vegetables, fresh bread, and a selection of local cheeses. The room was smaller than the drawing room, more intimate, with a single long table that encouraged conversation. Candles provided illumination, their flames steady in the still air, casting shadows that swayed gently on the walls. As we ate, conversation flowed around the mystery that had brought us together. Holmes encouraged each scholar to share their perspective, listening with that intense attention that made speakers feel their words carried weight and significance. Professor Blackwell spoke extensively about the linguistic aspects of the discovered journal, explaining how it combined Latin passages with Old English phrases and symbols that appeared to derive from even older sources, possibly Pictish or pre-Roman Celtic. The symbols repeat in patterns that suggest formulaic expression, perhaps ritual language or mnemonic devices for preserving oral traditions in written form. Yet, whoever created this possessed education in classical languages alongside knowledge of indigenous traditions, an unusual combination, suggesting either a medieval monk with access to local informants, or perhaps a much older tradition of scholarly syncretism than we typically acknowledge. Miss Marsh leaned forward as he spoke, her enthusiasm evident. "This aligns perfectly with the oral histories I have collected. Several of our eldest residents recall stories passed down from their grandparents about the keepers, individuals charged with preserving ancient knowledge through the centuries. According to these accounts, the keepers would periodically reveal portions of their knowledge when they deemed humanity ready to receive it." "Fascinating folklore," Holmes said, his tone carefully neutral, "though I wonder about the mechanism. How would these keepers determine readiness? What criteria would guide such decisions?" "The stories are vague on specifics," Marsh admitted, "but they consistently mention signs and portents, celestial events, social transformations, the convergence of particular individuals in particular places." Dr. Frost had been eating in silence, but now he set down his fork with deliberate care, the slight sound drawing everyone's attention. You speak of folklore and linguistic puzzles as though they are academic exercises. But consider the implications if these objects are genuine, if they represent an unbroken tradition of hidden knowledge spanning centuries or longer. What right do we have to uncover secrets that others chose to conceal? What responsibility accompanies such discoveries? The room fell quiet, except for the gentle crackle from the dining room fireplace. His words had introduced a weight, a gravity that transformed the conversation from intellectual exercise to something more profound. An ethical question, rather than a factual one, Holmes observed, yet equally important. Watson, you have said little. What is your impression thus far? I considered my response, aware that all eyes had turned toward me. I observe people of obvious intelligence and sincere motivation approaching the same phenomena from different perspectives. Professor Blackwell sees linguistic and historical puzzles to solve. Miss Marsh perceives validation of cultural traditions she values and seeks to preserve. Dr. Frost recognizes potential consequences that concern him deeply. Each perspective likely contains elements of truth, and perhaps the full truth requires integrating all three. Well said, Ashford interjected. This is precisely why I believed Mr. Holmes's involvement essential. We need someone who can synthesize these different viewpoints into coherent understanding. Dinner continued with somewhat lighter conversation, touching on village life, the peculiarities of moorland weather, the challenges and rewards of scholarly work in isolation. Gradually, I felt the group relaxing, the initial formality giving way to more natural interaction. Even Dr. Frost seemed to unbend slightly, offering occasional observations that revealed both his erudition and his underlying humanity. As the meal concluded and we returned to the drawing room for coffee and brandy, Holmes finally raised the question I knew had been waiting. I would like to examine the objects themselves, if that can be arranged. Tonight, if possible, or first thing in the morning. Tonight would be difficult, Professor Blackwell replied. The objects have been secured in the church for safekeeping, and while I have a key, Reverend Ashworth, no relation to our host, is particular about access during nighttime hours. However, I can ensure we have full access beginning at dawn. Would that suffice? Perfectly, Holmes agreed. It will allow Watson and me to rest from our journey and approach the investigation with fresh minds. The evening wound down gradually, our guests departing one by one into the cold night, each wrapped in heavy coats against the chill. Through the window, I watched them cross the darkened square, their lanterns bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps, eventually disappearing into the village's dark embrace. Holmes stood by the dying fire, his profile sharp in the ember glow. An interesting ensemble, Watson, each hiding something, though whether those secrets relate to our mystery or merely to the private complexities all humans carry remains to be determined. You suspect one of them. I suspect everyone and no one. Someone in this village created those objects, or knows who did. Someone orchestrated their discovery during the snowfall's isolation, ensuring maximum impact and mystery. The question is not merely who, but why. What purpose does this elaborate presentation serve? I stifled a yawn, suddenly aware of how the long day had accumulated its weight in my bones. Perhaps morning will bring clarity. Morning will certainly bring examination, Holmes replied. Clarity will require considerably more. We retired to our respective rooms, and I fell into bed with gratitude. The softness of the mattress and the warmth of the blankets enveloping me like comfort itself. Through my window, I could see stars emerging from breaks in the clouds, their light distant and cold, yet somehow reassuring. The village around me slept, or pretended to sleep, while its mysteries waited patiently for dawn. My dreams that night were strange and vivid. I walked across snow-covered moors, while symbols glowed beneath the white surface, and voices spoke in languages I almost understood, saying things I almost remembered. I woke several times, briefly disoriented, before settling back into deeper sleep, where dreams finally released me into simple darkness. Dawn arrived with surprising gentleness, light seeping into the sky gradually, transforming black to grey to palest blue at the eastern horizon. I rose, washed in the basin Mrs. Pemberton had filled with surprisingly warm water, and dressed for a day of investigation, choosing practical clothing suitable for potentially spending hours in an unheated church examining mysterious artifacts. Downstairs, I found Holmes already at breakfast, consuming toast and coffee with abstracted attention while reading a book he must have borrowed from Ashford's library, a volume on medieval monasticism in northern England. He looked up as I entered, nodded a greeting, and continued reading for another moment before setting the book aside. There were Cistercian monasteries throughout this region, he said, without preamble, as though we were continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. Orders known for preserving classical learning alongside Christian theology. Many maintained scriptoriums, where monks copied ancient texts, sometimes adding their own observations and integrating local knowledge. If our mysterious journal derives from such a source, it would explain the linguistic mixing that intrigued Professor Blackwell. You think a medieval origin, then? I think nothing yet, merely accumulating possibilities. The objects could be genuinely ancient, could be modern forgeries, or could represent something between newer works created using ancient techniques and knowledge. Each possibility leads in different investigative directions. Ashford joined us shortly thereafter, followed by Professor Blackwell, who arrived precisely as the church bells chimed 7 o'clock. Together, we walked across the square, our breath visible in the cold morning air, the village still largely asleep around us, though smoke rose from several chimneys, and I glimpsed faces in windows here and there. The early risers, or those whose curiosity about our activities outweighed their desire for rest. The church stood on the square's northern side, a structure whose age showed in its solid Norman architecture, thick walls of grey stone, narrow windows that spoke of eras before large glass panes became feasible. The door, massive oak bound with iron, opened with a deep groan that echoed in the morning stillness, a sound that seemed to announce our entrance to forces beyond merely human witnesses. Inside, the air smelled of old stone and candle wax, of aged wood, and the particular scent churches acquire over centuries of prayers and silences. The space was not large, perhaps capable of seating 100 worshippers, with simple pews arranged before an altar of carved stone. Morning light filtered through the narrow windows, creating beams that cut through the dimness like divine attention, highlighting specific points in space. Professor Blackwell led us to a side chapel, a smaller space separated from the main nave by a low stone wall. Here, upon a table covered in dark velvet, the 7 mysterious objects had been arranged with obvious care and reverence, as though they were religious relics rather than merely historical artifacts. Holmes approached slowly, his entire being focusing down to laser intensity. And I knew I was witnessing that remarkable transformation, where he became something more than merely an intelligent man. He became an instrument of pure observation, every sense attuned to the slightest detail. The wooden box occupied the center position, and Holmes examined it first, not touching initially, merely observing from multiple angles. It was approximately 12 inches square and 6 inches deep, constructed from a dark wood that gleamed despite its apparent age. The spiral patterns that covered its surface had been carved with microscopic precision, each line exactly the same depth, the spacing mathematically regular. "The wood is bog oak," Professor Blackwell offered quietly. "Timber preserved in peat bogs, which can survive for thousands of years. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The carving was done with tools of exceptional sharpness and control." Holmes withdrew a magnifying lens from his pocket and bent close to the surface, examining the spirals inch by inch. Several minutes passed in silence before he spoke. "There are microscopic tool marks, barely visible, but present. The carving was done by hand, not machinery, by someone with extraordinary skill and infinite patience. The pattern is not merely decorative. It functions as a maze, with a single pathway from the outer edge to the center. A puzzle, perhaps, or a meditation device." He straightened and moved to the journal, which lay open to a particular page showing both text and illustration. The illustration depicted what appeared to be a landscape, hills and valleys, rendered in simple but effective lines, with symbols scattered across it like a map marking significant locations. "May I?" Holmes asked, and at Blackwell's nod, he carefully turned pages, examining each with the same focused intensity. The journal contained perhaps 50 pages, all handwritten in ink that had aged to deep brown, the parchment showing wear but remarkably well preserved. "Professor, you said the languages mix Latin, Old English, and unknown symbols. Have you identified any recurring themes in the translatable portions?" Blackwell moved closer, his enthusiasm for his specialty evident. "Yes, indeed. The Latin passages speak primarily of preservation and transmission, the duty to protect knowledge across generations. The Old English portions are more poetic, describing the landscape in terms that suggest sacred geography, particular locations imbued with significance. The unknown symbols appear most frequently in proximity to the illustrations, as though annotating or labeling the landscape features." Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers hovering over, but not quite touching, a particular symbol. "This one recurs frequently. You have seen it elsewhere, Watson?" I leaned in to look. The symbol resembled a tree, but stylized, abstract, with 3 branches emerging from a central trunk, each branch terminating in what might have been a spiral, or perhaps a fruit. Something about it tugged at memory, but I could not place it. "It appears Celtic in character," I suggested, perhaps representing the world tree or similar concept from indigenous mythology. "Possibly," Holmes agreed, though his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied with this explanation. He moved next to the remaining objects, a small silver mirror, whose surface retained surprising reflectivity despite apparent age. A stone carved into a perfect sphere, its surface smooth as water, several metal discs engraved with geometric patterns, and a clay tablet bearing text in yet another unknown script. Each item received the same meticulous attention, Holmes examining every surface, testing weight and balance, bringing his lens to bear on the finest details. I watched the process with familiar admiration, knowing that his extraordinary mind was cataloguing, comparing, constructing theories, and discarding them, narrowing possibilities through pure analytical force. Ashford and Professor Blackwell watched with fascination, occasionally offering information or answering Holmes's terse questions, but largely remaining silent, recognizing that they were witnessing a master at work. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of examination, Holmes straightened and moved back from the table, his expression thoughtful. These objects tell a story, though not yet the complete narrative. They are genuinely old. The materials, the craftsmanship, the aging patterns all confirm significant antiquity, centuries at minimum. Yet, their condition suggests careful preservation, storage in controlled environments, until quite recently. Someone possessed them, protected them, and has now chosen to reveal them. The question we must answer is who had access to such items, and why reveal them now, in this manner, in this particular village? Could they have been hidden here originally, I asked, perhaps buried on the moors or concealed in some building, now uncovered by chance or deliberate searching? Possible, Holmes acknowledged, though I note that each object appeared in a different location, spread throughout the village. If they were hidden together, why not present them together? The dispersed discovery suggests theatrical intent, a desire to create a sense of mystery unfolding across time and space. Professor Blackwell looked troubled. You suggest someone is manipulating us, creating a mystery artificially? I suggest someone is communicating, Holmes clarified. Whether manipulation or invitation, revelation or test, I cannot yet determine. But these objects did not simply appear through supernatural agency. Human hands placed them, human minds planned their discovery, and human purposes drive whatever unfolds here. At that moment, the church door opened again, admitting a burst of cold air and a new figure, Reverend Ashworth, whom I had not yet met. He was a man of middle years, portly and somewhat breathless, with the perpetually worried expression of someone responsible for things beyond his control. Mr. Holmes, I presume, and Dr. Watson, forgive my absence. I was called to a parishioner's sickbed. I trust Professor Blackwell has provided access to the objects. They have become quite the focus of village attention, I must say, creating both interest and concern in equal measure. Holmes acknowledged the introduction courteously, and assured the Reverend that we had been well accommodated. Tell me, have there been any additional discoveries since Mr. Ashford departed for London? Any new objects or unusual occurrences? The Reverend's worried expression deepened. In fact, yes. Just yesterday, a stone cairn was discovered on the moorland north of the village, a structure that several of our long-time residents swear was not present previously. It contains carvings similar to those you see here, and Miss Marsh has photographed it. The site has become something of a pilgrimage point, with villagers hiking out to see it, despite the cold and the remaining snow. Holmes and I exchanged glances. We should examine this cairn ourselves, Holmes said decisively. Would it be possible to arrange immediately? I can guide you, Ashford offered. The walk takes approximately an hour, following the old sheep paths. The terrain is manageable, though you will want sturdy boots and warm coats. We returned to Ashford's residence to prepare for the expedition, donning the walking gear we had wisely packed. Mrs. Pemberton provided a basket of provisions, bread, cheese, flasks of tea, anticipating we might be gone for several hours. As we prepared to depart, Miss Marsh appeared at the door, camera equipment slung over her shoulder. "I heard you are visiting the cairn," she said, without preamble. "I should accompany you. I know the location precisely, and you may find my photographic records useful for comparison." Holmes agreed readily, and our party of 4 set off northward from the village, following a path that climbed steadily into the moors. The landscape opened around us, vast and wild, the sky enormous overhead, with clouds moving in stately procession, their shadows sweeping across the hills like the thoughts of gods. The air carried the complex scent of moorland, heather and peat, whetstone and hardy grasses, the mineral bite of exposed rock. Wind moved constantly, sometimes gentle, sometimes gusting hard enough to require leaning into it, speaking with a voice that seemed older than human language, forming words in a tongue the earth itself might understand. We walked in companionable silence, each absorbed in private thoughts, the only sounds our footsteps, our breathing, and the wind's endless monologue. I found my mind drifting into that peculiar state long walks induce, where thoughts flow without conscious direction, where revelations arrive unbidden, where the rhythm of walking and the vastness of landscape combine to dissolve the boundaries between self and world. After perhaps 45 minutes, Miss Marsh pointed ahead to where a rocky outcrop rose from the moorland like a ship from the sea. "There," she said, "the cairn sits on the eastern side of that formation, positioned to catch the morning sun." As we drew closer, the structure resolved itself into clarity, a pile of stones, deliberately arranged, standing perhaps 6 feet high and circular in plan, its surface covered in the carved symbols we had now come to recognize. Someone had expended considerable effort to create this monument in a location far from casual observation, visible only to those who knew where to look or who wandered these remote paths with intention. Holmes circled the cairn slowly, examining it from every angle, occasionally crouching to inspect particular symbols or construction details. I followed his example, noting how the stones had been carefully selected for similar size and shape, how the carvings had been executed with the same precision we had observed on the wooden box, how the entire structure possessed an aura of deliberate significance. "The stones themselves are local," Holmes observed, "weathered by exposure to moorland conditions for considerable time before being gathered and assembled here. Yet, the carved symbols show little weathering, suggesting relatively recent creation. This cairn is perhaps weeks old, possibly constructed during or immediately before the snowfall that isolated the village. But who could have built it without being observed?" Ashford asked. "The village, though small, pays attention to comings and goings. Someone carrying tools and constructing this monument would surely have been noticed." "Unless they worked at night," Miss Marsh suggested, "or unless they are so familiar a presence on the moors that their activities attracted no particular attention." Holmes had moved to the cairn's eastern side, where a particular arrangement of stones created what might have been intentional, a kind of niche or alcove facing toward the sunrise. He knelt there, his face close to the stones, and suddenly reached in, his hand disappearing into the shadows. When his hand emerged, it held an object wrapped in oiled cloth. We gathered close as he carefully unwrapped it, revealing another artifact, a small wooden figurine, carved in the same style as the box, depicting a human form in a posture of both reverence and attention, arms slightly raised, face turned upward. "Object number 8, Holmes murmured, waiting patiently for its discovery. placed here knowing that curiosity would eventually lead investigators to this precise spot. He turned the figurine slowly, examining every detail. The carving was exquisite, capturing not just form, but suggestion of personality, intelligence evident in the rendered features despite the stylization. On its base, a single word had been carved in clear Roman letters. Testimony. Testimony, Miss Marsh repeated softly. Witness to what? Or perhaps the act of witnessing itself? Context will determine meaning, Holmes replied, carefully rewrapping the figurine and securing it in his coat. But I note the progression, objects appearing in sequence, each discovery leading toward the next, creating a narrative path we are meant to follow. Someone is telling us a story through these artifacts, revealing it piece by piece, and we have just read another chapter. We spent another hour examining the cairn and the surrounding area, Holmes noting various details, and occasionally making brief notations in a pocket journal. The wind intensified as we worked, carrying a sharpness that suggested weather approaching, and by unspoken agreement, we began our return journey. The walk back passed in thoughtful silence, each of us processing what we had observed. The morning's brightness had given way to overcast conditions, the light flattening, making the landscape appear simultaneously vast and intimate, as though the moors themselves were leaning in to listen to our thoughts. We reached the village in early afternoon, cold but invigorated, and repaired to Ashford's home, where Mrs. Pemberton had prepared a hearty lunch, thick soup, fresh bread, and apple tart that steamed when cut. As we ate, Holmes finally spoke the thought I suspected had been forming throughout our expedition. We need to understand the village's history more deeply. Who settled here? What traditions they brought? What stories have persisted across generations? Miss Marsh, you have collected oral histories. Would you share what you have learned about Thornwick's origins? She set down her spoon, her expression becoming animated. The earliest written records date to the Norman period, but the oral traditions speak of settlement far older. According to the stories I have collected, this valley was considered sacred by pre-Roman inhabitants, Brigantes tribes who dominated this region before the conquest. They supposedly maintained a tradition of knowledge keepers, individuals trained in memorization and transmission of crucial information about astronomy, agriculture, healing, and what they called the patterns, natural cycles and correspondences that governed reality as they understood it. When Christianity arrived, she continued, some of these knowledge keepers reportedly converted and entered monasteries, where they merged their traditional knowledge with Christian learning. The Cistercian monastery, that once stood 10 miles from here, now ruins, allegedly became a centre where this syncretic tradition flourished for several centuries. The monastery was dissolved under Henry VIII, its inhabitants dispersed, but some stories suggest they carried certain knowledge into hiding, preserving it through secret societies and family traditions. Professor Blackwell nodded in agreement. The linguistic evidence supports cultural mixing, indigenous traditions coexisting with classical learning. The journal we are examining could easily have originated in such an environment, representing an attempt to encode knowledge in ways that would survive persecution or cultural suppression. And Dr. Frost, Holmes asked, what is his perspective on these historical claims? Dr. Frost is skeptical of romantic historical narratives, Ashford replied. He argues that we tend to project our desires for lost wisdom onto the past, creating myths of ancient enlightenment that never existed in the forms we imagine. Yet even he admits that the objects themselves demand explanation beyond simple dismissal. A timeline, I repeated. You think there is urgency to this? A deadline of some sort? Perhaps, or simply optimal conditions. The snowfall created isolation and drama, ensuring maximum impact for the discoveries. The presence of 3 scholars with relevant expertise ensured proper interpretation. Mr. Ashford's position in the community provided the means to engage outside investigation without alarming civil authorities. Each element seems carefully considered, as though someone has been planning this revelation for considerable time, waiting for the right confluence of circumstances. At that moment, a knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Mrs. Pemberton admitted Dr. Frost, who entered with an expression of agitation barely controlled. "Mr. Holmes," he said, without preamble, "I need to speak with you privately. I have information regarding these objects, but it is complicated. I am uncertain whether sharing it helps or hinders. Yet, I find I cannot remain silent." Holmes rose immediately. "Of course, Doctor. Mr. Ashford, might we use your study?" We were shown to a book-lined room at the house's rear, quieter and more private, where a small fire burned low. Dr. Frost waited until the door closed before speaking, and even then he seemed to struggle with where to begin. "I am not who I claimed to be," he finally said. "That is, my name is genuine, and my academic credentials are real. But my reasons for coming to Thornwick were not those I professed. I was sent here, or rather, I sent myself, following clues that suggested something significant was hidden in this area, something connected to my family's history." He moved to the window, looking out at the grey afternoon. "My grandfather was a scholar of esoteric traditions, medieval Hermeticism, and what he called continuity traditions, knowledge streams that survived from ancient times through organized preservation efforts. He believed that certain families and communities maintained guardianship of this knowledge, protecting it until humanity reached a stage of development where it could be safely revealed and properly understood." "And you believe Thornwick is such a community?" Holmes asked, his voice neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging. "I believe my grandfather did," Frost replied. "He left notes, fragmentary and cryptic, suggesting that in this region, a particularly important cache of preserved knowledge remained hidden, guarded by descendants of the original keepers. He died before completing his research, and I inherited both his papers and his obsession." He turned back to face us, his expression raw with emotion. "When the objects began appearing, I recognized elements from my grandfather's notes, specific symbols, particular construction methods. I realized the revelation he had sought was occurring, but I find myself terrified rather than excited. What if this knowledge, whatever it may be, was hidden for good reason? What if some truths are dangerous, destabilizing, destructive?" Holmes regarded him with unexpected sympathy. "Knowledge is neither dangerous nor safe in itself, Dr. Frost. Only the use to which it is put carries moral valency. But I understand your concern. Tell me, these notes your grandfather left, do you have them here? Might I examine them?" Frost hesitated, then nodded. "I will bring them to you this evening. They are fragmentary, sometimes incoherent, the work of a mind brilliant but increasingly troubled as he pursued leads that yielded more questions than answers. I warn you, they make for disturbing reading." "I have read disturbing materials before," Holmes assured him. "And Watson here has accompanied me through investigations that touched upon humanity's darker aspects. We do not frighten easily, though we remain appropriately cautious. After Frost departed, promising to return after dinner with his grandfather's papers, Holmes and I remained in the study, sitting in companionable silence while the fire whispered its endless secrets to itself. "What do you make of his confession?" I finally asked. "I make of it another piece of the puzzle," Holmes replied. "Frost arrives in Thornwick supposedly seeking quiet for research, but actually pursuing his grandfather's obsession. Within 2 years, objects related to that very obsession begin appearing. Either Frost himself is responsible, creating or revealing items to validate his grandfather's theories, or someone knew of his presence and his interest, timing the revelation to coincide with his residency. You suspect him, then? I suspect everyone, Watson, but I also recognize genuine distress when I see it. Dr. Frost is disturbed by these events, which suggests either extraordinary skill at deception or sincere concern. The grandfather's papers may illuminate which. The afternoon deepened toward evening, and we eventually rejoined Ashford in the drawing room, where we passed the time before dinner in quiet conversation. The light faded early, winter asserting its dominion over the hours, and by the time we sat down to eat, full darkness had claimed the world beyond the windows. Mrs. Pemberton had prepared roasted chicken with herb stuffing, winter vegetables glazed with butter, and a trifle layered with cream and preserves. We ate with good appetite, the day's exertions having sharpened hunger, and spoke of inconsequential matters. London news that seemed distant and irrelevant, the characteristics of Yorkshire weather, the challenges of maintaining historical buildings in such climates. Dr. Frost arrived as we finished, carrying a leather satchel that bulged with papers. He looked more composed than during our earlier conversation, as though having made his confession provided relief despite his ongoing concerns. We returned to the study, and Frost emptied the satchel onto the desk. Dozens of pages covered in cramped handwriting, sketches, diagrams, and what appeared to be copied symbols and texts. The organization was minimal, more stream of consciousness than systematic research, and I could see immediately what Frost had meant about his grandfather's troubled state of mind. Holmes began sorting through the materials, occasionally pausing to examine a particular page more closely, or to compare 2 different sketches. I watched over his shoulder, trying to extract meaning from the fragmentary notations. One page caught my attention, a drawing of the same symbol we had noted in the journal, the stylized tree with 3 branches. Beneath it, written in English, was a phrase: the threefold witness, those who carry, those who interpret, those who apply. Knowledge requires all 3 or becomes incomplete, dangerous, sterile. Your grandfather understood something crucial, Holmes murmured, studying the same page. He recognized that information alone is not knowledge, and knowledge alone is not wisdom. The system he was investigating, this continuity tradition, apparently included safeguards, dividing crucial understanding among multiple guardians to ensure it could neither be lost nor misused. He continued through the papers, occasionally making notes in his own journal, cross-referencing between different pages, gradually reconstructing the elder Frost's investigations. Hours passed, the fire needing replenishment twice, the darkness beyond the windows becoming absolute, except where distant stars pressed cold light through gaps in the clouds. Finally, near midnight, Holmes sat back with a long exhalation. Your grandfather came remarkably close to understanding what exists here in Thornwick. He identified this village as a possible location for a preserved cache of knowledge dating to the Brigantes period and earlier. He believed this knowledge related to what he called terrestrial harmonics, an ancient understanding of landscape energies, astronomical alignments, and their relationship to human consciousness and community well-being. Essentially, I said, trying to clarify, a sophisticated pre-scientific understanding of how environment affects human experience. Precisely, Watson. Before we divided knowledge into separate disciplines, ancient peoples apparently developed integrated understandings that combined what we now call astronomy, geography, psychology, and agriculture into unified systems. The elder Frost believed that this holistic knowledge, though lacking modern scientific rigor, contained insights we have lost in our specialization. Dr. Frost was leaning against the mantelpiece, exhaustion evident in his posture. And the objects appearing now, they represent this knowledge being revealed. They represent an invitation, Holmes corrected. Someone is inviting those capable of understanding to engage with this preserved knowledge, but they are doing so carefully, revealing it incrementally, perhaps testing the response, perhaps building context necessary for proper interpretation. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, as though nature itself was commenting on our discussion. Rain had begun falling again, drops tapping insistently against the glass, and the sound created a cocoon of intimacy, separating our lighted room from the dark, wet world beyond. The question remains, Holmes continued, who among the village residents possesses both the artifacts and the knowledge to orchestrate this revelation? Professor Blackwell has the linguistic and historical expertise. Miss Marsh has deep familiarity with local traditions. You, Dr. Frost, have family connection to this area of study. Mr. Ashford, as a long-time resident and landowner, would have access to properties where items might be hidden. Even Reverend Ashworth, as keeper of the church, occupies a position relevant to knowledge preservation across generations. You are saying any of us could be responsible, Frost said quietly. I am saying that motive, means, and opportunity are widely distributed, Holmes replied, which suggests we must look to another factor. Who among you would have reason to begin this revelation now, at this particular moment? Before anyone could respond, we heard rapid footsteps in the hallway, and Mrs. Pemberton appeared at the study door, her usual composure shaken. Gentlemen, forgive the interruption, but you must come immediately. There are lights on the moor, multiple lights, moving in patterns, and the entire village is gathering to watch. Some are saying it is the keepers, others fear supernatural forces. Reverend Ashworth has asked if Mr. Holmes would attend. We grabbed our coats and followed Mrs. Pemberton outside, where we found the square filled with villagers, despite the late hour and the rain. All faces turned toward the north, toward the moors we had traversed that morning, where indeed lights were visible, perhaps a dozen of them, too steady to be natural fires, too mobile to be stationary structures, moving in what appeared to be deliberate patterns across the dark landscape. Holmes watched intently, his sharp eyes tracking the light's movements. Lanterns, he said finally, carried by individuals who know the terrain well, moving in formation. They are tracing a pattern. Do you see, Watson? Each light follows a specific path, and together they create a larger design. I tried to follow his observation, and gradually I perceived it. The lights were indeed creating a shape, though too large to see all at once, requiring time and attention to recognize. It resembled the three-branched symbol, drawn in light and movement across the dark moors. A signal, Holmes continued, or a summons. Someone is calling attention to a specific location, inviting witnesses, creating spectacle sufficient to ensure all attention focuses where they desire. Should we investigate? Ashford asked, appearing beside us. I can organize a group to trek out, though in darkness and rain, the going will be hazardous. No, Holmes said decisively. This is theatre, meant to be observed from here. Attempting to reach those lights would be precisely what the organizers do not want. They create a mystery visible but not immediately accessible, allowing wonder and speculation to build. We will visit the location tomorrow in daylight, where we will discover whatever has been prepared for our finding. The lights continued their pattern for perhaps 30 minutes, long enough for the entire village to witness, for the image to burn into memory, for stories to begin forming even as the event unfolded. Then, as though at a prearranged signal, all lights extinguished simultaneously, leaving only darkness and rain, the moors returning to their inscrutable silence. The villagers began dispersing slowly, speaking in hushed, excited tones, theories and interpretations flying like sparks from a fire. We returned to Ashford's home, where he insisted on opening a bottle of whiskey, declaring that such an evening required stronger fortification than tea. As we sat around the drawing-room fire, glasses in hand, listening to rain and distant wind, Holmes spoke thoughtfully. We are being guided through a carefully constructed experience, each element designed to create wonder, curiosity, and receptivity. Tomorrow's discovery will be significant, perhaps the culmination of this elaborate revelation, perhaps another step in a longer journey. But whoever orchestrates these events possesses theatrical skill equal to their historical knowledge. You sound almost admiring, I observed. I admire competence in any domain, Holmes replied with a slight smile. And I confess to appreciating mystery when it is crafted with such care. Most of the mysteries we encounter, Watson, are accidents or crude deceptions. This is different. This is artistry in service of purpose. We eventually retired, though I found sleep elusive despite exhaustion. My mind replayed the day's discoveries and the evening's light show, trying to perceive the pattern beneath the patterns, the story being told through these carefully arranged revelations. Rain continued its gentle insistence against my window, and at some point in the small hours, I finally drifted into dreams where symbols came alive and walked the moors, carrying lanterns that lit their way through centuries. Morning arrived grey and damp, the rain having stopped, but leaving the world soaked and dripping. I rose with a strange sense of anticipation, knowing that today would bring answers to at least some of our questions. Holmes was already up, naturally, and I found him studying the figurine we had discovered at the cairn, turning it in the morning light that filtered through the breakfast room windows. Notice how the carving technique differs slightly from the box, he remarked as I entered. The tool marks, though similarly skilled, show a different hand. The strokes flow differently. The approach to the wood's grain varies subtly. I believe we are dealing with multiple craftspeople, all trained in the same tradition, but each possessing individual style. Suggesting an active community rather than a single individual, I said, pouring coffee. Precisely, and the word carved on the base, testimony carries interesting implications. Testimony requires a witness, an event witnessed, and an audience to receive the account. We are being positioned as that audience, invited to receive testimony about something significant. Ashford joined us shortly, looking somewhat weary, confessing that he had slept poorly, his mind too active with speculation. Half the village is planning to trek to the moors this morning, following the approximate location of last night's lights. Reverend Ashworth is concerned about mass hysteria or disappointed expectations. He has asked if you would be willing to address the gathered villagers, Mr. Holmes, to provide some rational framework for understanding recent events. Holmes considered this request seriously. I will speak with them, yes, though I can offer rational framework without yet providing definitive answers. But perhaps that is precisely what the community needs: assurance that mysteries, however profound, remain subject to human understanding and patient investigation. We finished breakfast and prepared for what promised to be an eventful day. The square was indeed filling with villagers, perhaps 100 people wrapped in heavy coats and carrying walking sticks, clearly intending to make the expedition to the moors. Professor Blackwell, Miss Marsh, and Dr. Frost were all present, and I observed them interacting with various villagers, answering questions, offering reassurances. Reverend Ashworth approached Holmes as we emerged from Ashford's home. Mr. Holmes, thank you for agreeing to speak. The people need to hear from someone with your reputation for seeing through deception and identifying truth. Whatever is occurring here, your presence provides considerable comfort. Holmes nodded and moved to the church steps, positioning himself where all could see and hear. The crowd quieted gradually, faces turning toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to barely contained excitement. "Friends," Holmes began, his voice carrying clearly in the damp morning air, "you have witnessed remarkable events over recent weeks. The appearance of mysterious objects, strange symbols, and last night's display of lights on the moors. It is natural to feel wonder, confusion, perhaps even fear in the face of such phenomena. But I ask you to remember that mystery and impossibility are not synonymous. Everything you have witnessed has natural explanations, and though we do not yet possess complete understanding, we move toward it through observation, reason, and patience." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "Someone in or connected to your community has orchestrated these events with considerable care and sophistication. Their purpose, as yet unclear, appears to involve revealing knowledge that has been preserved across many generations. Whether you interpret this through the lens of folklore, history, or spirituality matters less than recognizing that human agency drives what you observe. We are not dealing with supernatural forces, but with human intention, human knowledge, and human communication." A voice from the crowd called out, "But why the secrecy? Why not simply explain?" "An excellent question," Holmes acknowledged. "Perhaps because the knowledge being revealed requires context and preparation to be properly understood. Perhaps because dramatic presentation serves pedagogical purposes, creating memorable experiences that ensure attention and retention. Or perhaps simply because the individuals responsible possess a theatrical sensibility and appreciate the power of mystery to focus human attention." He gestured toward the northern moors. "Today, we will discover what last night's display was designed to lead us toward. I invite you to accompany us, to witness whatever revelation awaits." but I ask that you do so thoughtfully, respecting both the physical landscape and whatever you may find. Mysteries deserve patience, not frantic conclusion-seeking. The crowd seemed reassured by his words, the anxious energy transforming into purposeful anticipation. We organised ourselves into a rough processional, those with the best knowledge of the moorland paths taking leading positions, others falling in behind. It was quite a sight. 100 people moving together across the landscape, a community united in curiosity and the desire for understanding. The walk took longer with such a large group, the pace necessarily slower, with frequent pauses to allow the elderly and children to keep up. Yet the atmosphere was almost festive, people chatting and speculating, children darting between adults with the boundless energy of youth. The morning brightened somewhat as we walked, clouds thinning enough to allow diffuse sunlight that transformed the wet landscape into a tapestry of subtle colours. The purple-brown of heather, the green-gold of winter grasses, the grey of exposed stone gleaming with moisture. We followed the same path Holmes and I had taken the previous day, passing the rocky outcrop where we had found the cairn, continuing further north into terrain that grew progressively more remote. The crowd strung out along the path, conversation diminishing as the landscape's vastness and the journey's exertion claimed breath and attention. After perhaps 90 minutes, the leaders stopped, and word passed back through the group. Something ahead. We pressed forward, and gradually I saw what had caused the halt. A small stone structure, partially collapsed, but still recognizable as human construction, standing in a shallow valley surrounded by low hills. It appeared to be ancient, possibly medieval, though its original purpose was not immediately clear. Holmes approached carefully, and the crowd fanned out in a loose semicircle, watching. The structure consisted of 4 walls of dry stone construction, perhaps 12 feet square, with most of the roof gone, though some stone lintels remained in place. The entrance faced east, toward the morning sun, and someone had cleared away much of the debris that had undoubtedly accumulated over centuries of neglect. Inside, we discovered what the previous night's light display had been designed to announce. The walls had been covered, floor to ceiling, with new carvings, the same symbols and patterns we had seen on the objects, executed on a much larger scale, creating an immersive environment. And at the room's centre, arranged on a flat stone that might have served as an altar or table, sat 3 books. Holmes entered first, followed by myself, then Professor Blackwell, Miss Marsh, and Dr. Frost. The crowd remained outside, peering in but respecting the space, understanding that this discovery carried significance that demanded measured response. The books were old but well preserved, bound in leather that had been regularly treated with oil to maintain suppleness. Holmes opened the first carefully, revealing pages of text and illustration, similar to the journal we had already examined, but more extensive, more complete. The second volume contained what appeared to be maps, detailed renderings of the surrounding landscape, marked with symbols and annotations. The third held records, lists of names, dates spanning centuries, what might have been family genealogies or succession records. A library, Professor Blackwell breathed, his voice filled with awe. They have been maintaining records across generations, documenting their knowledge and their lineage. These volumes represent centuries of accumulated understanding. Miss Marsh was examining the wall carvings, her fingers tracing the symbols without quite touching them. These tell stories. I recognize elements from the oral traditions I have collected. Here is the threefold witness, the division of knowledge. Here is the wheel of seasons, the cycles that govern life. And this, I believe, is a map of knowledge itself, showing how different understandings interconnect and support each other. Holmes was focused on the third book, the genealogical records. His eyes moved rapidly down the columns of names, and suddenly he stopped, his finger marking a particular entry. Watson, look at this, a name you will recognize. I leaned in to see where he pointed. Cornelius Ashford, dated 1843, and above it, tracing back through generations, a line of Ashfords extending to the book's earliest entries in what appeared to be medieval script. We turned simultaneously to look at Ashford, who had remained near the entrance. He met our gaze with an expression that mingled resignation and relief, the look of someone whose secret has finally been revealed. Yes, he said quietly, my family has been guardians of this knowledge for 23 generations. We are the carriers in the threefold system, those who physically preserve the materials and ensure their transmission across time. But we cannot act alone, which is why the other roles exist. Holmes closed the book gently. Professor Blackwell is the interpreter, the scholar capable of translating and contextualizing the preserved knowledge, and the applier. He turned to look at Dr. Frost. Your grandfather was meant to be the applier, the one who would take the interpreted knowledge and determine how it could be meaningfully integrated into modern understanding. But he died before completing his role, which is why you inherited not just his research, but his position. Frost looked stunned. You are saying this was all arranged, that my grandfather's research was not accident, but design? Not entirely arranged, Ashford corrected, stepping further into the structure. The system allows for organic discovery and involvement. Your grandfather recognized patterns others missed, followed threads others ignored. His capacity for the applier role manifested in his actions. And when we became aware of his research, we, that is, those of us continuing the Guardian tradition, began leaving traces for him to find, guiding him toward Thornwick, toward fuller understanding. His death before arrival was tragic and complicated our timeline. But when you appeared, following his path, we recognized that perhaps the role passes through bloodlines, through inherited passion for understanding. The crowd outside had grown very quiet, everyone straining to hear this conversation that was transforming mystery into revelation. Holmes gestured towards the entrance, inviting them to come closer, recognizing that this knowledge, whatever it might be, was being shared not just with investigators, but with the entire community. As people pressed in, filling the small structure and spilling out around it, Ashford continued. The knowledge preserved here relates to what our ancestors called right relationship, understanding how human communities can live in harmony with landscape, seasons, and each other. They observed patterns in nature, recognized cycles in human experience, and developed practices that promoted well-being across generations. Some of this knowledge appears in what we now call folklore, superstition, or old wives' tales. Some was incorporated into religious practice and seasonal celebrations. Much was lost as communities urbanized and disconnected from direct dependence on land and weather. But why hide it? Someone called from the crowd. If this knowledge is valuable, why not share it freely? because decontextualized knowledge can be misunderstood or misused. Miss Marsh answered, her voice carrying scholarly authority. Imagine trying to explain advanced mathematics to someone who has not learned basic arithmetic. The symbols and practices preserved here build upon each other, requiring foundation before advancement. Releasing them prematurely could lead to confusion, frustration, or worse, selective adoption that twists meaning. Professor Blackwell added his voice. Additionally, throughout history, those who held knowledge outside approved religious or political frameworks faced persecution. The tradition of secrecy arose partly from necessity, protecting both knowledge and those who carried it. Even today, claims of ancient wisdom often attract ridicule or commercial exploitation, neither of which serves genuine understanding. Holmes had been listening intently, and now he spoke. Mr. Ashford, you orchestrated the recent revelations, placing objects, creating the light display, guiding us to this location. Why now? What triggered this particular moment for revealing knowledge your family has guarded across centuries? Ashford took a deep breath before answering. Multiple factors converged. The presence of 3 scholars with appropriate expertise in a community small enough to manage the revelation carefully. Dr. Frost's arrival, representing the bloodline my predecessors had identified as capable of the applier role. And frankly, my own age and health. I am 63, and recent illness reminded me that guardianship must be passed to a new generation. But our tradition requires that knowledge not simply be handed over, but earned through engagement, curiosity, and demonstrated commitment to understanding over mere possession. So you created a test, I said, understanding dawning. The mysterious appearances, the theatrical presentations, all designed to observe how individuals and the community responded to mystery, to determine who could be trusted with greater responsibility. Yes, Ashford confirmed, and I confess to experiencing considerable relief at your arrival, Mr. Holmes. Your reputation for discretion and your demonstrated respect for knowledge holders of all kinds suggested you could help manage this transition, ensuring it proceeds thoughtfully rather than chaotically. The structure had fallen silent as people absorbed these revelations. Then, gradually, questions began. Practical questions about what the knowledge actually consisted of, how it might be relevant to modern life, what would happen next. Ashford, assisted by the 3 scholars, began answering, explaining how the books contained agricultural wisdom, astronomical observations, herbal medicine, and what might be termed early psychology, understanding of human nature and community dynamics. We remained at the site for hours, the community engaging with centuries of accumulated wisdom, each person finding elements that spoke to their interests or needs. Some were drawn to the agricultural knowledge, recognizing that their farming practices already incorporated elements of the preserved understanding. Others were fascinated by the astronomical observations, the careful tracking of celestial cycles. Still, others found meaning in the psychological insights, the descriptions of how communities maintain cohesion and support individual well-being. Holmes observed all of this with satisfaction, and during a quiet moment, he spoke to me privately. This is perhaps the best resolution we could have hoped for, Watson. Knowledge emerging not into the possessive hands of a single scholar or institution, but into a community capable of collectively holding and applying it. Whatever wisdom these books contain, it will be tested against lived experience, refined through practice, preserved because it proves useful, rather than because tradition demands. As afternoon wore on and the sky cleared fully, revealing pale blue stretching to all horizons, we began the return journey. The mood was celebratory, people walking in animated discussion, children running ahead with renewed energy. The landscape that had seemed forbidding and mysterious on our outward journey now appeared friendly, familiar, a place where human understanding and natural patterns could coexist. Back in Thornwick, as evening approached, Ashford invited us to a dinner he had arranged, bringing together the principal figures in what he now openly called the Revelation. We gathered in his dining room, Holmes and myself, Ashford, the 3 scholars, Reverend Ashworth, and several village elders who had been aware of the Guardian tradition and supported its continuation. The meal was simple but abundant. Roasted vegetables from root cellars, preserved fruits, fresh bread, and ale from the village's small brewery. Conversation flowed easily. The tension that had marked earlier interactions, now replaced by companionable collaboration. During dessert, a rich custard flavoured with vanilla, Dr. Frost addressed Holmes directly. "I must thank you, Mr. Holmes. I came to Thornwick burdened by my grandfather's obsession, uncertain whether I was honouring his memory or being consumed by his unfulfilled dreams. Your presence helped transform that burden into participation in something larger, more meaningful than individual ambition." "The transformation was yours to make," Holmes replied. "I merely provided external perspective, but I am gratified if our investigation contributed to your peace of mind." Professor Blackwell raised his glass in toast. "To mysteries solved and knowledge shared, may we prove worthy of what has been entrusted to us." We echoed the toast, and I felt the peculiar satisfaction that accompanies investigations that conclude not with arrests or scandals, but with understanding and community strengthened. Later, as Holmes and I prepared for bed, we reflected on the case's unusual nature. No crime was committed, I observed, yet there was genuine mystery, real investigation, and significant revelation. The best cases are not always about crime, Watson. Sometimes they concern human nature, history, and the various ways communities preserve and transmit what they value across generations. This investigation reminded me that mystery exists not to obstruct understanding, but to protect it until proper conditions for revelation arise. The following morning, we prepared to depart Thornwick, our work complete. The village gathered to see us off, expressions of gratitude and new friendship marking faces that had initially regarded us with cautious curiosity. Ashford provided letters of introduction to colleagues who studied similar traditions in other regions, suggesting that what we had encountered in Thornwick might be part of a broader network of preserved knowledge. The carriage carried us back toward the railway station, through landscape now familiar, the moors no longer forbidding, but simply themselves, ancient, enduring, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow accommodating of human presence when approached with respect. On the train southward, as the Yorkshire hills gradually gave way to gentler country, Holmes was characteristically quiet, processing the experience, filing away details for future reference. I watched the landscape blur past and thought about the books we had seen, the knowledge they contained, the generations of people who had committed themselves to its preservation. "Do you think it will survive?" I asked Holmes eventually. "This tradition they have guarded so carefully. If it proves useful, yes, he replied. If the knowledge they preserved actually helps communities navigate the challenges of existence, it will persist and spread organically. If not, it will fade back into obscurity, and perhaps that too would be appropriate. The test of preserved wisdom is not its age, but its continued relevance. We arrived in London as dusk gathered, the city's lights beginning to glow in the gathering darkness. The familiar sounds and smells of urban life enveloped us, so different from the spacious quiet of the moors, yet equally real, equally human. We returned to Baker Street, to our comfortable rooms where fires burned, and Mrs. Hudson welcomed us with her characteristic mixture of warmth and practical concern. That evening, sitting in our customary chairs with the city murmuring beyond the windows, Holmes and I didn't speak much. But in that comfortable silence, I felt the contentment of work well done, of mysteries honoured rather than merely solved, of having witnessed something rare, a community embracing its history and its future simultaneously. In the weeks that followed, I received occasional letters from Thornwick, updates on the ongoing work of translating and applying the preserved knowledge, accounts of community gatherings where teachings were shared and discussed, reports of young people showing interest in continuing the Guardian tradition into new generations. Professor Blackwell wrote extensively about his translation work, his excitement palpable even in written form. Miss Marsh described how the oral traditions she had collected were being compared with the written records, each illuminating the other. Dr. Frost's letters spoke of finding peace with his grandfather's legacy, of discovering purpose in the role he had inherited. Holmes read these letters with interest, but without surprise. Communities that survive across centuries do so because they maintain connections to accumulated wisdom while adapting to changing circumstances, he observed. Thornwick is demonstrating precisely this balance. I incorporated our investigation into my chronicle of Holmes's cases, though I wondered if readers would find it too quiet, too lacking in dramatic confrontation and criminal revelation. Yet Holmes, when I shared this concern, disagreed. The human hunger for mystery is not primarily about crime, Watson, but about meaning. People want to believe that existence contains depths beyond surface appearance, that knowledge persists across time, that ordinary lives can touch extraordinary continuities. Our Thornwick case speaks to these deeper hungers, and I suspect readers will find it more, not less, satisfying than adventures involving theft or murder. As always, his judgment proved sound, but more than that, the investigation lingered in my own mind with particular vividness. On difficult days, when London seemed especially harsh or human nature particularly disappointing, I would remember the village gathered around ancient walls, engaging thoughtfully with inherited wisdom. I would recall the moor's vast patience, the rain's gentle persistence, the firelight on faces committed to understanding rather than merely knowing. The snowed-in village had kept its secret for generations, until the right moment and the right people converged to receive it. And in that convergence, I glimpsed something essential about how meaning survives, not through rigid preservation, but through living transmission, each generation adding its interpretation while honouring what came before. Now, dear listener, as this story finds its end, I hope it has served its purpose, providing mystery enough to occupy your mind while allowing relaxation to claim your body, offering narrative sufficient to maintain interest while creating space for the drift toward sleep. The village sleeps now in my story, as perhaps you sleep in yours, both held by that mysterious force that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care, that gives rest to the weary and peace to the troubled. If you have found comfort in this tale, I invite you to like and subscribe, to return for more stories that blend mystery with gentleness, investigation with peace. May your dreams be pleasant, your rest complete, and your waking tomorrow bright with possibility. Good night, wherever you are. May the mysteries you encounter be intriguing rather than troubling. May the knowledge you seek find you at the proper time. And may you always have firelight and friendship to warm the darkest hours. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep well.